Thanks, Misa, for the music. I was busy playing and forgetting we are in a workshop. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Just please unmute so that we can see you are here and we just say hi to each other. Tato, how are you?
Fine, yourself?
Hi, guys. How are you? You can wave. We just Sanele, Nolutando. I can see you guys. Primo, Unjani, Lutando. I can't see you.
You?
Yes, I just saw that we see each other and we are all here. Good morning, everyone. We can go ahead and mute all our microphones. I just ask just 2 questions before we start. If you can just tell me today's session, what is it about? You can put in the chat. If you want, you can raise your hand and then you can actually speak. Please just put in the chat box, what is the session about today? We have 27 people, so at least I should have 27 responses in the chat box. What are we learning about today, please? In the chat box, please, can you respond in there? My boss said is here, you will fire me if you guys don't respond. If you don't respond and tell us what you are learning about, it will be a big problem. Please, can you put in the chat box what today's session is all about? Well done, Yamkela. Thank you so much. Vulnerability assessment. Anyone else who has a different response, you can put that in the chat box. Okay, so we are learning about vulnerability assessment. Can you just put as well in the chat box what we learned about last week? Anything that you still remember from last week's discussion, can you please put in the chat box? Yes, and Siwe vulnerability assessment. Who else? Please just tell me of what we learned last week, your specific local vulnerability assessment, anything else that you learned last week. I see vulnerability assessment. All right. Yes, specific to hazards and all that. Oh, that's Catherine. Catherine, you are cheating.
I thought I'd help jog people's memories.
Thanks for that. Okay. All right, guys, for those who responded, and thank you so much for joining this platform. So as usual, we will continue again, and we all remember Dr. Katharine Vincent. She is our facilitator again today. We are taking off from where we left. So over to you, Kath. Oh, before I do that, I just want to acknowledge my team members who are here on board. We have Mumisa, we have Claire, we have got Abigail, and we also have our programs manager, Seth Clady, who is with us. Thank you so much, colleagues, for joining us. Some will join us later. Over to you, Catherine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And hello again, everyone. It's nice to see you through the screen. And I'm looking forward to continuing our discussions on vulnerability assessment. Let me just share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see my PowerPoint there, okay. I'm just going to switch my video off so it doesn't distract me, so I don't have too many things showing on my screen at one point. So last week, we spoke about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the framework that they have for risk assessment, which was this diagram here, which I hope you will remember. So according to this, the risk of negative impacts from climate change depends on the interaction of 3 different factors: the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability. So we need to understand the nature of those 3 different parts in order that we're able to understand levels of risk. And last week, as I see in the chat box, I'm glad to see that some of you have remembered this. We were particularly focusing on the first part. We were particularly looking at hazards. So one of the exercises we did for you was for you to identify key climate hazards and trends that are affecting your particular communities and have affected them in the recent past. And of course, we also said that in the context of a changing climate, the hazards that we see are likely to change into the future. So we need to plan for greater frequency, greater magnitude of the types of hazards and trends that we've seen in the past. And when we're talking about climate hazards, we're talking about temperature, extremes of temperature, heat waves, frost, rainfall changes, and that can be in terms of total amounts of rainfall or seasonality of rainfall, when the rain is falling, trends within the rainy season. Or hazards can also refer to extreme events such as floods and droughts. And I remember across all the different communities that you're working in, we had different ranges of climate hazards that exist. So we looked at hazards last week, and I hope you all either have your notes that you took last week in the exercises, or can remember what you did, because we're going to build on that today by continuing to look through these different components. So we're going to continue looking at exposure, and then we're also going to look at vulnerability. Just as a reminder, though, of what all these different components are, I gave the example of coronavirus, which, of course, we've all is a hazard that we're all very aware of over the last 18 months. So in that case, coronavirus is the hazard, and then the exposure is how often any one individual comes into contact with that particular hazard. So that reflects, because the coronavirus only lives in people, the exposure depends on how often you're coming into contact with other people. So of course we see different levels of exposure. And then it's also contingent on vulnerability. So we know with coronavirus, we know the older you are, the more vulnerable you are when you're exposed to the hazard. We know that men are more vulnerable than women. If you're overweight, you're more vulnerable than someone who's standard weight or underweight. And if you have a whole range of pre-existing medical conditions, they can all increase the level of vulnerability if you're exposed to that hazard. So that can put you at a higher level of risk than someone who has low levels of vulnerability or is not exposed very frequently. So the risk is the outcome of all of those 3 factors together, and it depends on the specific composition of the exposure and vulnerability, and that can differ from person to person, from place to place, depending on the scale that we're looking at. But remember, we also said it's important to bear in mind that this is not deterministic, because we can modify our levels of exposure and we can modify our levels of vulnerability if we enable adaptive capacity. So we all know what builds our adaptive capacity in relation to the coronavirus. We know that if we wash our hands, if we wear a mask, if we keep physical distance, if we work from home if we can, so we're reducing our exposure, all of those things can modify our exposure and vulnerability, and in turn can reduce our risk level. And it's exactly the same situation with climate hazards. the hazards exist, but we have different levels of exposure to them and different levels of vulnerability to them. And the key thing is, where we have high exposure to a climate hazard and high vulnerability to a climate hazard, those are the kind of red flag areas, and those are the ones where we really want to prioritize our adaptation so that we can reduce those overall risk levels. And then, capitalizing on what I put in the chat box, just wanted to give a quick reminder that vulnerability overall is a kind of propensity for harm, the potential for there to be negative impacts. But vulnerability is very much hazard specific. So you can be highly vulnerable to one hazard, but have no vulnerability at all to another hazard. And in the context of climate, obviously we're particularly concerned with climate hazards. That's not to say that people who are not vulnerable to climate hazards are not vulnerable at all, but the likelihood is that they're vulnerable to different things. So we gave the example of someone who's farming. Obviously, the levels of crop production are very much linked to the rainfall and temperature conditions. So if there's a drought, that farmer is going to be very exposed to that drought and could potentially have very high level of vulnerability if she doesn't know that the drought is coming, if she hasn't planted early maturing varieties, for example. So she could be very much at risk of a drought. But for that same hazard, someone who is working as a truck driver, for example, she may be far less vulnerable because she's not as exposed to that particular hazard. So that's not to say she doesn't have vulnerability at all, but she doesn't have vulnerability to drought because her livelihood is not contingent on the weather conditions in the same way that a farmer's livelihood is. So I think that's just an important point to reiterate. We have different levels of vulnerability to different hazards. And when we're specifically thinking about climate change, we need to specifically understand the vulnerability and exposure to climate hazards. And I also showed this picture. You know, we have this saying in English, "Oh, we're all in the same boat." But actually, I would change that and say we're not all in the same boat. We're all in the same storm, but the boats that we're in vary significantly, and that reflects our vulnerability and our exposure. So again, what we need to understand is the nature of those different boats and who's in the boat that makes them at highest risk of the storm in which we may all find ourselves. So where the storm is a hazard. Okay, so you remember last week we ended off when I'd asked all of you, thinking of the particular community context in which you work, I'd asked all of you to jot down some characteristics of the context and the resources. And we did some feedback on those towards the end of the session. So we heard about, in your particular communities, what the natural environment is like, what the public infrastructure is like, what the population structure is like, what people's livelihoods are dependent on, and the types of buildings that they live in. And I did ask you, if you had time to think about it, to maybe consider mapping out what your particular community context looks like, where the resources are, the resources of different types, because that can often be helpful for climate vulnerability assessments, particularly for hazards relating to floods, for example. If you're at the coast, or if you're very close to a river, then you have high exposure to flooding. And sometimes mapping that out can show you which people and which pieces of infrastructure are going to be more exposed relative to others. So what we're going to do today is basically build on, we're still in this phase of looking at the exposure. We've looked at the hazards, and you've started to contextualize the context of where you're working. So to work out the exposure, what we need to do is bring those two pieces of information together. So we need to think about the climate hazards that we've identified, and then think about these different characteristics of the context, and basically kind of systematically go through and say, okay, for say the first hazard that you identified was drought. So you need to say, okay, what impact is drought going to have on the natural environment? If you've said the natural environment in your community, there's a large amount of cropland and a natural forest, for example, then that drought is going to have an impact on that natural environment. Then we'd want to do the same for public infrastructure. If there's a drought, what impact might that have on public infrastructure? What impact might it have on population? And so on. So we basically take each column header we've got for a climate hazard, and then each row as the characteristics of our community, and ask the question, what impact will the hazard have on the particular context that we've outlined. So I can give an example here. Last week, I used an example of a community that I've worked in, and I told you a little bit about what the context is like, farming community alongside a river, so there is some risk of flooding, a few bits of public infrastructure. Population has a reasonably large number of elderly people. So putting those two pieces of information together, the hazards that were particularly relevant in that community were increasing temperatures, erratic rainfall and dry spells, and flash floods. Those were kind of the top three climate hazards for this particular community. So if I think about the increasing temperatures, what impact does that have on the natural environment? Well, if we were being highly technical, we could probably look at the specific crops that are being grown and the boundaries of the temperature range that those crops can cope with. But looking into the past and the trends, it's not the increasing temperature that has the biggest effect on crops. So I haven't put anything there as being particularly important. Same with public infrastructure. There's a school in this village, but it's a very stable structure, and so increasing temperatures is not going to affect the school building too much. Because the population is aging a little bit, increasing temperatures is going to create a risk of heat stress. So I've put heat stress in the box here. For livelihoods, because a large proportion of this particular community is dependent on farming, those increasing temperatures could reduce the maize crop yields. So I put that there under the livelihoods box because the crops are important for livelihoods as opposed to just being in the natural environment. And then for buildings, particularly for houses which have tin roofs, which is a minority, but there are some houses with tin roofs. They, of course, magnify the heat, as I'm sure you can all imagine on a very hot day. So one of the potential exposures there is discomfort within houses with tin roofs if we have increasing temperatures. And then I've done the same thing. So I've just gone through how I've done it for one hazard, but then I've done it for the same for the next two hazards. So same for erratic rainfall and dry spells. I ask myself for each of the different components of the context, what might that mean? And then flash floods again, for each of the different contexts, what might that mean in practice here? So what I would like you to do now, building on what you've done already, is basically follow that same process for the climate, using the climate hazards that you've already identified and the community context that you have outlined already that we did last week. So systematically say, okay, for this hazard, what effect will this have on the natural environment? For this hazard, what effect will it have on public infrastructure, on population, on livelihoods, on buildings? And then you can just jot those down in the relevant place within the table. I've left an other column there in case there's anything else that you can think of which doesn't necessarily come under the categories that we used. but you won't necessarily have anything to add into there. Does that make sense for everyone, what I'm asking you to do?
Yes, it is.
Great. Okay. Let me give you then, I'll give you, let's say 10 minutes just to think through that for your particular context. And then again, like last week, it would be great to have a couple of you share the exposure that you've identified for your particular communities. So it's 11:25. I'll give you till about 11:35 to go ahead and do that. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to speak up, or of course you can also write them in the chat box.
Katharine, if you can show the previous slide so that maybe they can also follow the example that you did.
Sure, I can,
Okay.
but remember it's very context specific. So yeah,
Yes,
what's
yes.
filling in the box here, of course, is for my context. So you need to do it for your context. But yeah, I can leave it up so you can have an example.
Hi, Sandra. Maybe if you can just explain to those who just joined about the activity, they might hear absolute silence and not understand.
Yeah, for anyone who's just joined, we're just. Oh, sorry, Sandra, did you want to come in there?
No, it's fine. You can go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, so we're continuing our trip through the risk cycle. So we'd identified key climate hazards that are affecting your communities last week, and we'd also started to outline the context of those communities, thinking about what the natural environment is like, what public infrastructure is like, what the nature of the population is, what people's livelihoods are based on, what the buildings are like, all these kind of things. Basically, we had some descriptions of communities, so those of us that are not familiar with them could picture what the context is like. So what we're doing now is merging those two sources of information by systematically saying, well, if the first climate hazard that I've identified, if that happens in this community, if we're exposed to that hazard, what will the impacts be on these different components of the community context? So that's why we're using the table, so that we can kind of go box by box and elaborate what the specific impacts might be if there's exposure to those climate hazards on those different components. So this is part of us building up a picture of the nature of climate risk that we see. So we had circulated a table that looks like the one that's on the slide now, but it's just, you can also just draw one out. But the key thing is to systematically go through each climate hazard with each aspect of the community context, so that we capture all the elements of exposure.
A reminder to everyone to please keep your mics off. Please try keep your mics on mute. Thank you.
So I'm seeing in the chat box a couple of people are mentioning the hazards again, as we'd identified next week. And I see Sanelli's also mentioned an example of an impact of the hazard. So in your table, if the hazard is, I'm seeing two mentioned. I'm seeing cold and dry, and as a result of that, some people were having to have access to food. So if your hazard is cold weather under livelihoods, you might say implications for food availability. Same if your hazard is drought, also under the livelihoods box, you would highlight that there's an issue of food security there. So it's building up a profile of the nature of climate risk. This may take a bit of time to go through when you finished. If you could just write finished. If I don't see any finished now, I'm going to assume that everyone needs a minute. Okay, I'm only seeing one finished, and I know this does take a while to work through this systematically, so I'm going to give you 2 more minutes. So Wonga, are you trying to share your screen? Or is that an accident? Because it's stopping me sharing mine. Okay, I'm seeing lots of people in the chat box giving a good description of the climate hazards, but the key, of course, now is to work out systematically where those hazards have exposure. And I see a couple of people have started putting their results in. So I think even if you haven't finished, don't worry if you haven't finished. The key is that you understand a little bit about how to do the process, because of course you will be doing this in a much more consultative manner at a later date to identify your potential adaptation projects. But maybe now we can share some feedback. Would anyone like to share what the impacts might be of the climate hazards you've identified in your particular community context?
Oh. Hello.
Hi there, please go ahead.
Okay. In natural and we have strong winds, which are blowing at 80 kilometers per hour. public
Wow.
infrastructure damage to houses and
Mhm.
uprooting of trees
Mhm.
and damage to schools. The
Mhm.
population being afraid of getting injured or dying because of the strong
Mhm.
winds. There is also damage to houses, and even houses fall due to the strong wind.
Mhm.
And also the damage to sorghum, because in our place sorghum is
Mhm.
mainly is the main crop. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nokapumla. So for high winds is the climate hazard that you've gone through there, and you've identified it's got impacts for the natural environment, for public infrastructure, for buildings, and for livelihoods. And that's great that you've elaborated what all of those are. This stage is really important because when you're thinking about designing your adaptation projects, for someone to evaluate if those adaptation projects are going to be successful, they really need to understand the nature of climate risk so they can see if the adaptation is well matched. And that's why this phase is really important. That's great, thank you. Anyone else like to share, please?
In the Free State.
Mm-hmm.
In the Free State, it's cold, and maybe if I start off by giving you the picture of the area, because I could not be with you in the previous session. It's a rather confused area because it's people in the city location and in the informal settlements as well. That is the area we cover in, yes. The farms are a bit far. We are not able to deal with farming, but small scale food production in the small gardens at home. Now, the cold weather affects all, but from last week we saw trees uprooted by the strong winds, but from 2 days ago the weather is very bad and cold and stormy winds. Mostly people who are affected are, even though they are low-lying, it's both when the rain is in the informal settlements. They are in a low-lying area. There are no trees around Bloemfontein settlements, so the strong wind goes straight to those informal settlements, and it's they are badly affected. The infrastructure is bad. It has declined very badly on the roads, and when it rains, the potholes it's like they get washed almost immediately, and you can easily sleep on the road because of tire burst, because of the potholes.
Great,
yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for outlining the context. I mean, I think this is again illustrates why it's so important that we do these vulnerability and risk assessments, because of course we may all have the same hazards that exist, but we have different levels of exposure based on where we are. And I really liked your example there with the trees. So you said there's high winds, and because there's no trees, the exposure is higher. You know, those winds of that same magnitude in an area where there's lots of trees, the trees would buffer that exposure a little bit.
Certainly,
great.
yes.
So you mentioned,
those that are in the areas where there are trees, the effects of the strong winds is better because the wind goes beyond the trees than because of the protection of the trees. Yes.
Yeah, that's actually, and that's a really good example of, so we've said that, you know, our role here is to kind of identify the climate risk and vulnerability, and ultimately, of course, we want to identify adaptation projects. So if it's the case that those high winds are the biggest threat, one of the ways that we can reduce that level of risk would be to promote adaptation, perhaps by planting trees around, because that would modify the level of exposure. It would reduce the exposure, and as a result, that would reduce the risk. So that's a potential adaptation that you might want to consider for that area, given what you've just explained about the particular exposure level. But that's great. So I heard a couple of different climate hazards there. So I'm sure you were able to put the specifics of the different hazards as you've just outlined for the different components of the community context that would give a good picture of the overall setting. Great, thank you. Let's just take one more. Who else would like to volunteer? Who's unmuted themselves? Sophia, please go ahead.
Yes. Okay, yes. I also was not part of last week's session, but for me, in the area where I'm coming from or where I'm staying, is the first thing is the extreme heat we have.
Yeah.
Because we are in a very drought area, and it doesn't even help a lot when you water your plants. When the sun is very hot, your plants will dry out. It doesn't matter even you have the shade to help and to help the plants resist this heat. So for us, the heat is too much, and then the quick winter comes. We have that. We can't say this season of this 3 months. This season will be heat, and the next 3 months will be then the frost of the winter period, because we can differentiate now between winter and summer. Like 2 weeks back, we have extreme cold, so our plants die because of the cold, and we already transplant the summer plants. So the cold and the heat is very for us. It affected a lot our gardens, our own gardens as well as our garden at our premises. So for me, there's 2 things. And then when it's dry and when your season starts with raining, then you have erosion.
Yeah.
Your soil is then flooding away because of the too much rain, because the water doesn't go deep into the ground. It's just a thing that floats away. So it takes the ground away, the soil away from the plants. So this is the thing that we struggle a lot with. And like we are in a Kalahari place, because there's no high trees for shade or to help. So we have the smaller nyana trees. So it also affects us a lot. Can't really say, no, this one will help and that one will help. No. So we have to look into how can we best then help or sustain our farmers, help the farmers to sustain their gardens in a good condition, because we are really affected most of the time.
Great.
You.
Thank you, Sophia. Yeah, okay, so I'm hearing definitely a lot of different climate hazards. And what's particularly interesting in what you've outlined there, Sophia, is another point that's important. I mean, of course, for the purposes of the short period of time that we have together with last week and this week, I'm trying to kind of take you through the different steps that you would follow. But of course, the degree of sophistication with which we can approach these steps is highly variable. So, I mean, I've just asked you to think about the top 3 climate hazards, but I'm hearing it's the extremes of temperature, and it's the amount of rainfall, but it's also the unpredictability and the not knowing what conditions are going to be like. So, things like we can make those hazards even more specific to context if we want to be more sophisticated. So rather than just talking about rainfall amounts, we can talk about unpredictability, for example. So just to note that, if you're conducting this type of assessment in a consultative manner with your communities, you can add layers of sophistication. And it definitely sounds like it's the livelihoods related impacts in that particular environment which are critical. So again, when we get through to the final stages of risk assessment, it's probably highly likely that that's where you would want to focus your adaptation efforts. Great, thank you very much. Okay, it seems you've all had a good chance to kind of think through, and I see there's some other inputs in the chat box, which is great. So the key thing here is just to kind of take this approach very systematically, because this is what we need to do to start building up this picture that we see of exposure. And those 3 examples of feedback that we've just had in 3 very different contexts shows exactly why it's important to do this, because the context really does matter. And from community to community, we will have different levels of vulnerability and risk which are occurring. Okay, so that's taken us through the exposure part. So we've now looked at hazards and we've now looked at exposure. So we're going to move on to the next part of the risk framework, which is vulnerability. And I've just said that we have differences from community to community, but of course, communities are not homogeneous either. We have a whole bunch of different people with different characteristics that make up communities. And so whilst we can look at community level, when we're thinking about vulnerability, we specifically want to look at the characteristics of the individuals that make up our communities, because that will also affect levels of vulnerability. The other thing that affects levels of vulnerability, as I've mentioned already, is kind of spatial, and particularly for floods, because they tend to occur in particular locations, then spatial vulnerability is important. But for most hazards, like changing temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, changing seasonality, they don't differ on a kind of micro scale. So for there, it's more the social aspects of the vulnerability that are important. So following through our kind of step-by-step process that we're looking at here, the next stage is to say, okay, well, we've looked at the climate hazards and we've looked at the levels of exposure. Now we need to ask the question, who would be most vulnerable when these impacts occur? So what I've added into my table here for the community that I was doing this exercise for, in red text, I've added in who would be most affected by all of the impacts that we've just identified in the last stage. So for increasing temperatures, my first climate hazard, I'd identified that would cause heat stress for the population. And it's of particular concern, heat stress, for people who are elderly and for pregnant women, because those are the characteristics of people that make them particularly vulnerable to heat stress. For the reduced maize crop yields that result from increasing temperatures, who's most vulnerable to that? Well, that's all the farming households. For any households in this community that don't farm themselves, their level of vulnerability is not so high. But for farming households, they'd be very vulnerable to this particular impact. And then for increasing temperatures, for buildings, I've noted that will cause discomfort in the houses within the tin roofs. Who will be affected by that? Well, in this particular community, the houses that have tin roofs is usually the wealthier members of the community. So who would be affected by that particular impact? It's the wealthier households. And then I've done the same thing for the other two climate hazards. So what I want you to do now, again, is using the same table that you've been building up and building on this exercise that we've just looked at, is to now go through each little box that you have and ask who would be most vulnerable to this impact if it were to occur. Does that make sense? Is everyone clear on what I'm asking you to do?
I think they are. We don't have any hands raised. So I think they do understand. If you don't understand, please raise your hand or write in the chat box or unmute yourself and let us know.
So basically, I'm asking you to build on what we've just done in the last step. And the question you're asking now is who would be vulnerable to the impacts that you've identified. So again, this one shouldn't take so long because you'll already have the impact. So I'll just give you 5 minutes or so to think about that and jot it down. And then again, it would be great to have a couple of people share with the group. So I'll just give you 5 minutes.
Can I react just?
Of course, please do.
Looking at our situation here in the Free State, all will be affected, but as I said earlier, others tend to feel the pressure more because of the poverty and because of the exposure, as you were saying, as with COVID, the example of COVID, that those who are more exposed to the challenges, but because the infrastructure with those in the affluent areas is better and tend to stand those challenges much better. But those in the informal settlement, because of their vulnerability and exposure to the fast changing weather, are more victims of the situation.
Yeah, so what I agree, and what I'm asking you to kind of focus on specifically here is thinking about the individual characteristics of the individuals within your community, because on aggregate, yes, it is often the case if you were comparing, say, one location with another, you could say that, you know, that this one has a greater risk, has a greater vulnerability. But even within the community, it's probably highly unlikely that every single individual has the exact same level of vulnerability to each of the hazards that you've identified, because not everyone is the same age, not everyone is the same gender, not everyone is involved in the same livelihood activities, not everyone has the same access to information. All of these factors affect individual levels of vulnerability. So I'm kind of pushing you to give us a little bit more information on within your community, which individuals or particular groups of people would be most vulnerable to each of the impacts that you've identified.
It is clear now.
Does that make sense? Okay, great. Esther, go ahead if you have a question. Esther, please go ahead. You're on mute at the moment, though.
Hello, Catherine.
Yep. Hi, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, I'd like to give my input here.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I'll note just the two extremes, the storm and drought.
Okay. So that's your
Yeah.
climate hazards that you've identified. Yep.
Is you know, the storm would come and it affects mostly school children because
Okay.
the infrastructure is destroyed, the school and the roads and bridges. So it becomes very difficult, and those few people who are the working class, they are also affected. But most vulnerable in that would be the farming and the poorer households.
Okay.
Definitely the crops get destroyed, and even the housing for the poorer, it's their housing and it's their livelihood affected by their storms. And some of them, they cannot rebuild their houses. Even the municipality just built temporal dwellings for them, and they end up living like that for years and years. And with drought, it's the most vulnerable are the still those farming and poorer households, because the poorer, you know, they can't even go and buy what they need for their families, for their nutrition. So drought affects them the most, so they are the most vulnerable.
Okay, so is the I just wanted to check, Bukeka, is the livelihood activities that most people are involved in the community that you're thinking about, are they mainly involved in farming and natural resource-based livelihoods?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
They depend on farming.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it is typically the case. I mean, for anyone who's dependent on natural resources, that does make you highly vulnerable to climate conditions, because of course the availability of those natural resources does vary significantly with the climate conditions. So that makes perfect sense. So the vulnerability is higher for those that are dependent on farming as opposed to those that are not. And of course, typically poorer members of a community will have less adaptive capacity because they have less options for drawing on other assets when those things fail. Yes. So great. So you can see how we're kind of building up pictures of these communities and the nature of difference within them. So we're slowly being able to see who is most vulnerable and why, and this will help us to identify the most appropriate adaptation options. That's great. Thanks, Bukeka. Anyone else like to share? Maybe someone who hasn't said much already. Please don't be shy. We want to hear about all these contexts.
I think Prim can share with us. I saw she did send something in the chat. It would be nice for it. Yeah. Prim, can you please elaborate?
Everyone, yes, I perhaps would align myself with what has been spoken already, but here we have household farming, which is affected by both drought and high heat. There is loss of livelihood, or source of livelihood, where people cannot continue with household farming. And then obviously that impacts on poverty and increases poverty, as well as disease profiling. And you find that they are more prone to diseases, even like I had said in my earlier chat, when it comes to diabetes, because there is no choice of food. They eat what is in front of them. And the other impact that we find is that with the shacks that they build, they are very vulnerable. They hardly have electricity at homes, so food gets spoiled overnight. So it's a vicious cycle when you get those uncomfortable hot weathers. As well as once you get those high velocity winds, houses get de-roofed, they get destroyed, crops get destroyed. And this, again, it goes to the low income earners who are more in number in the community. So when it comes to these weather changes, they are very vulnerable. Lastly, the children as well are vulnerable to high heat and heat strokes, because no one thinks for them that they must have water. And this is what we need to even teach, that during high heat, they must carry a bottle of water. They must drink water. Over and above, I agree, the elderly are also vulnerable. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Prim. Yeah, really, really good points about the social distribution of the vulnerability. And I think, again, you know, if we're thinking with a view to identifying adaptation projects, I mean, I'm already hearing when you say about the children, I mean, one thing that that is increasingly done to reduce vulnerability to heat stress with schools, for example, is to make sure that trees are built around them to provide some shade, and kind of combining that with awareness raising about the importance of shade and consuming enough water when it's very hot, for example. They would be good examples of how an adaptation project could be designed, because it would reduce the vulnerability of those children to the hazards and exposure that have been identified. And just one other thing I wanted to pick up on that you said there, Prim, which I think is also very important. So we've said that vulnerability is very hazard specific. So at the moment, we're focusing on vulnerability to climate. And of course, we're hearing that those who are most vulnerable are those that are whose livelihoods are very dependent on climate. But your point about that then having a knock-on effect on people's nutritional intake and their health status just goes to show how a lot of hazards that we experience kind of intersect with each other. And we often hear mention of climate change as being what's called a threat multiplier. So it doesn't necessarily always cause problems by itself, but when it coincides with existing problems, it can end up making them much worse. So again, when you're doing a climate risk and vulnerability assessment, kind of highlighting some of those knock-on effects and causal chains is also really important to do.
Thanks, Catherine. I think we just have two more. And I do have my favorites, Luke Jacobs. Can we hear from you, Luke?
Hi. So I will start with the first hazard I chose is a flood. And I think it's best if I explain what happens, and then I'll talk about those who are affected the most or who's most vulnerable.
Okay.
So I said that the river banks will break, and then I said that the most vulnerable people are obviously the ones that live closest to the river, because when the banks break, their houses will be flooded. And then by public infrastructure, I said that the gravel roads will be flooded. There will be many puddles. It will become muddy. No one will be able to drive there. And these roads are mostly found in informal settlements. So the people affected there are the ones living in informal settlements. Same thing with population. I said that the floods will cause anxiety and depression, and most of the time it's where there's not proper roads, proper pipelines and drainage systems, and this is mostly in informal settlements. So once again, the people affected there will be the ones in the informal settlements' livelihoods. I said that there will be damage to the vineyards, grapes, where the grapes grow. The harvest will become less. So the farm workers in that instance will be mostly affected, as they won't be able to have as much jobs, and there will obviously be economic damage. Same thing with the buildings, severe damage to those living in informal settlements. So I think that's the common theme by my with regards to the floods by my hazards. It's the fact that the people living in informal settlements, they don't have the best resources to combat the floods, and then they will obviously be affected by it, definitely.
Great, thank you, Luke. And yeah, that's a good example with the floods of the spatial vulnerability, because of course if you don't live near a river, then you're not going to be exposed to that hazard. But what often happens, of course, is that the poorest and most vulnerable people end up living in the most exposed areas because they don't necessarily have a choice of going anywhere else. So we end up with this kind of compounding situation where already vulnerable people end up inadvertently increasing their exposure, which of course in turn magnifies the risk that they have. Thank you.
Good morning. May I share something?
Yes, please do.
You can go ahead.
I am Gwen from Grahamstown.
Hi, Gwen.
Good morning. I've got 2 points I want to share with you.
Okay.
Our problem would be the drought and also the lack of water in Grahamstown.
Yes.
It would affect vulnerable people. Everybody in Grahamstown is vulnerable to lack of water because sanitation is the main problem on the matter, and also health hazards around it, and mostly children at school, because nutrition it does have an impact on the nutrition at schools, and also in people's garden that we have started in their households, and also with the program that we have of women and youth in our church. We've got a food garden that supplies a soup kitchen that we have in our church. People who are living with HIV and AIDS are vulnerable on the matter, and also people that would get food from the soup kitchen twice a week are affected. And how have we done so? We have tried so many strides to speak with the municipality regarding of drilling boreholes for our church so that people can benefit from that one. So it is affecting many people, and also soil erosion is the factor that is affecting people because this drought, the soil is being eroded. So we cannot have crop because of the soil erosion. So that's what I want to share with you this morning.
Great. Thank you, Gwen. And I think that's again a really good illustration of why vulnerability matters, because you mentioned people living with HIV and AIDS, of course, with compromised immune systems. So whilst everyone would be affected by changing food availability, if we're looking at relative levels of vulnerability, then for those for whom it's really critical that they have a good nutritional intake, like people living with HIV and AIDS, then of course they would be particularly vulnerable in that context. So yeah, these are some, I hope you're seeing from all of these examples that everyone is sharing, I hope you can all see what we mean by these different social levels of vulnerability, and how initially we might think, oh, everyone's affected in the same way, but actually when we take it kind of one step further, we can see, okay, no, we can see some people are affected more by certain exposures and some people are affected relatively less. So again, this can help us design adaptation interventions which are well targeted to reduce the risk. Great. Okay.
Yes,
thank you. We are going to stay with this theme a little bit, because so we've identified the climate hazards, we've looked at the exposure, and we've looked at the different levels of vulnerability to that hazard exposure, and seen how it might differ between different groups of people, or between people depending on where they are, which is particularly the case with floods. What we kind of need to do just to kind of summarize all of this and bring it together is look at the levels of risk. So as we said, risk is a function of these three components, the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. So in this table here, I've just put a variety of different combinations we might have of hazard exposure and vulnerability. Now, if a hazard exists, but there's a low level of exposure to it and a low level of vulnerability, then the risk level is low. We don't need to worry about that. I can give you an example. So I'm just outside of Pietermaritzburg. The snow hazard technically does exist. We do get snow occasionally. I'm not far from the Drakensberg, but I'm not likely to be exposed to it today. It's not the right season for snow. And I have low vulnerability because my coat is sat right behind me. So if it were to snow, I'd put my coat on and it wouldn't be a problem for me. So that's not something we need to worry about. It is a hazard which exists, but I have low level of exposure and low level of vulnerability. So we don't need to worry about that. What we do need to worry about is when the hazard exists and we have a high level of exposure to it and we have a high level of vulnerability to it. So what you've all just outlined is circumstances where exposure can be high and when vulnerability can be high. So there we have high risk. Those are the ones that we need to be concerned about. So what I would like you to do now, just as the kind of final step here, is to kind of make a qualitative judgment on where you think the highest levels of risk are. So I'm going back to my table here from my context that we've seen several times. So increasing temperatures creates heat stress for people, and that's the people who are particularly vulnerable to that are the elderly and pregnant women. But relatively speaking, when I think about the overall nature of vulnerability and exposure, that's not one that I would consider to be the most critical. It is a risk for certain groups of the population, but it's not the most important risk. So I haven't marked that one. I have marked the reduced maize crop yields that affect farming households. And I think this is a particularly high risk because it affects a lot of people. This community is mainly a farming community. So if we're exposed to this hazard in the future, the impacts are going to be significant. There's a high level of vulnerability, a high level of risk. The other two that I've highlighted here, if I were to pick the top three risks, one is flash floods, which affects people who are living by the river and farmland by the river. So this particular community is basically a bit of a linear settlement kind of along the river. So when there is a flood, lots of people will be exposed to that flood and a lot of their farmland will be affected. So again, this is a significant risk because it affects lots of people in quite a serious way. And similarly, for the flood-related hazard, I've also put a red box around the damage that's caused to traditional houses. It's mainly the poorer households who have the traditional houses, but when there's a flood, those houses get washed away and a lot of people are left homeless. So again, if I were to make a judgment on all the exposure and vulnerability that I've identified, the three risks that I think are highest are the ones that I've put into boxes here. So as the last step in this process, what I would like you to do now is conduct this kind of risk ranking to work out which of all the different exposures and vulnerabilities that you've identified, which ones you think are the most critical, either because they affect a lot of people or because they affect a certain number of people in a particularly bad way. Does that make sense, what I'm asking you to do? Yes, no? This is tricky when I can't see you, so I can't see if anyone's looking very confused or if you're all nodding in agreement and busily marking out where you think the priorities are. I'll assume that you're understanding what I ask you to do, unless you say otherwise, but please do feel free to shout if that's not clear or if you have a question. Otherwise, I'll just give you a few minutes to mark out the top three risks. And of course, in a few minutes, I'll ask a few people to share again, because we're now coming to some idea of our risk and vulnerability assessment to start thinking about adaptations.
It becomes so quiet. I wonder if people are there. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe again, when you've done that, when you've identified the top 3 risks, maybe you can just write finished in the chat box again, so that we can see how long that's taking it, and then we'll ask for some feedback again. I'm not seeing any finished yet, so I'm assuming everyone's still thinking about it and evaluating across what you've done so far.
Catherine, I do think probably maybe let's start to hear from them. Lutando, can you please tell us your 3 high risks? I see some are being put in the chat box. Lutando, can you unmute yourself?
Oh. So we're particularly interested in not just the hazard itself, but the risk levels. So the impacts that the hazard is going to have, taking into account the exposure and vulnerability. So I see in the chat, Bukeka has put crops destroyed by drought. Okay, so yeah, and we'd already heard that was very much a farming community, so that makes sense that's the number 1 risk. Bonnie's put safe drinking water. Bonnie, I don't think we've heard from you to hear about your context. Would you be able to explain a little bit about why you say population and safe drinking water is a significant risk?
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi. Water is our everyday. It's a basic need. So that's the reason I'm saying it will affect the population, because we just need water every time, all the like. So the climate change has an effect then to this thing, water.
Okay, so whereabouts are you? Where's your community located, Bonnie?
It's located in Butterworth, in one of the rural areas called Kiniga.
Okay, okay. So is there situation of warmer temperatures and drying? Is that the climate hazard that's creating a situation for water availability?
Exactly.
Okay,
And
got it.
thank you so much. And weather changes in a way, changes in one day, changes twice, three times, and there's this strong wind. It is affecting our area.
Great. Okay, thank you. Yes, and I think, you know, for when I showed last week the projections for future temperature and rainfall, we know that large parts of South Africa are going to experience increased water scarcity, partly as a result of climate, but also partly as a result of increased demand. So yes, I think you're not alone, Bonnie, in having that as a significant risk for your community. I'm sure plenty of others are thinking the same. Great, thank you for sharing. Anyone else like to highlight some of their key risks? I can see there's lots of names that I haven't heard speak yet. I would like to hear your voices so I can hear a voice to put to your name.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone.
Hello. Go ahead, Mahadi.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Yes, yes ma'am. One other thing that I ever experienced here in Matatiele is that here we got high temperatures where I can see a lot of carcasses for the cows along the roads, the horses. I just can't talk about the growing of the fields. You find that it's just a mess all around. It's too dry. Then along the way, while the rain comes, it becomes with a hail. You know the hail.
Yeah.
It destroys even the cars for the people that think. It destroys the windows. It destroys even those small plants that you said maybe you can rely upon. It destroys everything. So here at Matatiele, we really experience lots and lots of things here. The strong wind destroys everything, the houses, the schools, the clinics, everything you can see now. I even remember at 1998, there was something like a snow. It was not the real snow, but it doesn't stop. It takes from September up to October, the whole month. All the cows, you can't even eat the carcasses for the cows because they were sour. So, and from there, we come along, as we come along after that risk, then appears the disease called AIDS. That destroys everyone. You know the youth. Most of the youth by that time all died. Most of them died. Thanks.
Thank you, Mahadi. Yes, and you've just illustrated, just underlined again, you know, why it's important that we look at the vulnerability and risk, because obviously in this community, livestock is very important. Some of the other ones that we've heard about, livelihoods are very different. So the way in which climate hazards are affecting them, of course, is going to be different. And again, yeah, the intersection of climate hazards and climate risk levels with other hazards is well illustrated with the challenges of HIV and AIDS, because people who are living with those conditions, that may make them more vulnerable when they're exposed to climate hazards. And of course, we also have the link the other way around. When people are very exposed and vulnerable to climate hazards, they may end up more exposed also to HIV. So there's lots of interrelationships between climate change and other stresses. Great, thank you. Maybe someone else who hasn't already spoken this morning. Michael, I can see your hands up. Please go ahead.
Our risk ranking as follows.
Great, go ahead.
It's economical meltdown there because our livelihoods depends on farming.
Okay.
Farmers. Now the second one will be drought. Because drought will impact on our economic activities. When there is drought, you can't plant, you can do whatever. As much as our livelihood depends on planting and farming. The last one will be the buildings overheat, because it will cause damage to houses and mud houses and houses who are roofed with asbestos, which causes asbestosis. Yeah, the sickness. I thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So yeah, again, a very specific set of circumstances, which again shows why we need to interrogate the nature of risk, because it does vary from place to place. Great, and then Emerentia, I can see you're also unmuted. Would you like to share? And Feni, please go ahead. Maybe Emerentia is having a problem with the microphone.
Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
With the risk levels, I identified three hazards actually. Extreme cold, the high temperatures, and flood. In my area, we in terms of risk, I'd say extreme cold it's not that high of a risk. It's a very minimum risk. It's not that there's no risk, very minimal, because we don't really experience cold weather for any.
Oh, Yamkela, I've lost your sound. I don't know if that's just me.
I think something's wrong with the sound because it just went blank.
Just went blank, didn't it?
Sorry
about that, Yamkela. We just lost you when you're in the middle of
the
Oh, there we go.
Yes.
There we go. Okay, sorry. Just say that bit again. We lost you, but then you came back. Oh, I think Yamkelo's lost the connection. Doesn't that always happen when you go to speak? Okay. Emerentia, okay, I see your message in the chat box. And if your audio is working, please go ahead while we wait for Yamkela to return.
Okay, excuse me, it's my connection. It's very terrible.
No problem, don't worry. Yes, Emerentia is also struggling with the connection. Yeah, please go ahead, Yamkela, whilst we can hear you. Hopefully it will hold for a few minutes.
Okay, as I said, it's the farmers and their livestock with the crops, the they are in a very high risk in terms of rising temperatures. Also the school children, because school children, as we know, they need to participate in physical activities when they get to school. And because we are in a rural area, by the time they get to school, they have to walk. Actually, before they get to school, they have to walk. Most of them have to walk for some distance. By the time they get to school, you find that kids are already tired, they're sweating, and the time maybe by the time it's break time, you find that kids are just want to sleep. They don't want to participate in any physical activities that they have to participate in during school hours. Also, the elderly too. The elderly, they prone to risk, because the elderly, as we know, they in my area actually, they want to do things in their own way. So now if they have rising temperatures, they find it very hard for themselves to do commercial farming for themselves, but not yes, it's very hard for them to do those things around the houses and all those stuff, you know. And poor households would depend on firewood to make fire, to cook, and all those things. That becomes very uncomfortable to deal with fire if it's already hot. So it becomes very uncomfortable and terrible for them. So fire, rising temperatures, they are a very high risk in my area. In terms of flood, I'd say it's definitely no, I wouldn't say definitely, but it's not really a risk in terms of floods, because our rivers, they're not really close to the houses and the buildings around us. They're not very big rivers. It's just two rivers, and even if it rains, but it's just easy to cross because there are bridges that are provided there. So floods, I wouldn't really put them as a risk for my area. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mkela. Yeah, and I think the way you've outlined that there is really nice, because I think you've highlighted exactly why it's important that we kind of follow this systematic process, because then we can be sure that we're identifying all the potential exposures and vulnerabilities, and then by kind of ranking which ones are important, like you say, you know, there might be a bit of flood risk where you are, but it's not significant because there's only two rivers and not many people are affected by it. You know, if we follow this kind of systematic process, then it really helps us to identify what the biggest risk is in the specific context. And yeah, again, the different nature of social vulnerability and the different age groups, different genders, and so on, of course, is a really important component of that. Great. Emerentia, are you back? I can see that you're trying to speak. Emerentia, do you want to have a go again? Can't quite hear.
Hello.
Yeah. Go ahead, Freddie.
Yes, I think before, let me first explain. I'm also staying in an informal settlement. Now, Sitteresdal is situated in a valley surrounded by mountains. So now, this informal settlement is closest to the river. Right?
Yeah.
So, in terms of the natural environment, I mean, if there's like earlier this year, especially during winter, there was a flood, and obviously a couple of houses in the informal settlement closest to the river, they were affected. So that is a risk. And the other thing is also people continue to stay closest to the river because once again, the people closest to the river is the people who are illegally staying there. And also, what floods also causes damage to our sex because you know it's an informal structure. So once again, the risk is that the people living in poverty of the poor household, that is also a risk if there's a flood. And with regards to also to floods, just remember we have two sets of pieces of land for commonage land, but that is not close to the river; it's more higher up. So there, in terms of the small scale farmer, flood is not really a problem because they are far away from the river whenever there is a flood. The other thing also with regards to high temperatures, there once again, small scale farmers are affected because whenever it's hot, it means that it becomes a shortage of water, and they are affected in that regard, and that is a high risk for the small scale farmers because they are dependent on the produce, and if they can't produce, it means they have to buy it against higher price.
A high price. Yeah, good point. Okay, great. Thank you, Freddie. Yeah, really, really good points. And yeah, again, you know, we talk about changing exposure, but we also have to, as you rightly said, bear in mind that some of the people who end up being at highest exposure is also as a result of loss of, lack of other choice, and perhaps settling illegally in areas because they can't afford to be elsewhere. So the exposure and the vulnerability can be very mutually enforcing. And I think that's also, to highlight the kind of increased costs of some of these changes. I think that's another key point to note. And as I've said, what we've tried to do, I mean, we've had obviously a very short period of time to kind of go through this process. And of course, it is possible to do risk and vulnerability assessments with increasing levels of sophistication if you have lots of time and effort and resources to use. Then this can be done in a much more sophisticated way. But what I wanted to show basically is that even if you don't have a large amount of resources available, it's still possible, following this fairly basic process, to just kind of systematically think through these different components of the risk, the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability, so that you can understand the real nature of climate risk in your community. And of course, that is what's really critical for identifying the most appropriate adaptation projects. So once we've looked at risk levels, if we look at this kind of blue bar on the right hand side, and if those red arrows reflect different levels of risk, once we understand the nature of risk and the exposure and vulnerability, then we need to start thinking about, okay, well, how can we can't necessarily change the hazard, but we can probably change our exposure to it, and we can probably change our level of vulnerability to it. So what do we need to do that, so that we can reduce our overall risk level from very high down to medium, maybe even low? So that's what we need to think about with adaptation projects. I am going to ask a couple of you if you've got any new thoughts on what adaptation projects might be appropriate, having kind of thought through this process. But I also wanted to point out something else, which is that when I think about all the examples that I've heard last week and this week, in some it's very clear that climate is a significant risk. When you think of the multiple hazard context, climate is very important for some of the communities that you're working in. But I have heard for some communities, there's obviously other hazards which are equally as important, if not more important. So I also wanted to point out that we're all obviously committed to development activities and improving the lives and well-being of people in the communities in which we work. So another way to think about this is also to kind of bear in mind, we're all stuck with climate change. The climate is going to continue to change into the future. So the context in which we think about development needs to bear that in mind. So a kind of cross-check that you might want to use in all your activities going forward is to think about how climate change might create risks for your activities and your intended development projects.
Needs to bear that in mind. In all your activities going forward is to think about calamities and your intended
development projects. Oh, that was a funny sound there.
Funny sound there.
So I can, let me give an example of this. So I work quite a lot in communities in southern Malawi, where the area is very dry already, and it's going to continue to get even drier in the context of a changing climate. And in the communities in which I work, food security is a big challenge. Large proportions of the population are not growing enough food to be able to sustain themselves, so they end up reliant on food aid. So food security is a problem that needs to be addressed, but in the past, a lot of food security interventions have focused on growing maize because that's what's always been done. But the problem is maize growing in many parts of southern Malawi is already at the kind of at the limits of tolerance. And in the future, there are large parts that are not going to be able to grow maize without significant efforts and investments in irrigation and the like. So if your development intervention is to address food security, you might want to think, okay, well, in the past, maybe we've encouraged maize, but climate change is going to create a risk to that. So how can we still try and contribute to food security, but do so in a way that will be sustainable in the context of the changing climate and the fact that we know that conditions there are going to become hotter and drier? Well, of course, there are other staple crops that can still be grown in those conditions. So sorghum, cassava, they could be used instead. I know there are issues with kind of taste and preference, and of course people would rather grow maize, but if they grow something else, then at least they can sell that, make some money, and then they can buy maize through the markets from other parts of the country where maize can still be grown. But the last thing I would want to do is kind of promote maize growing at the moment, because in the context of a changing climate, that's not likely to be sustainable in the long run. And that's what we would actually call an example of maladaptation. So you're promoting an activity which is not going to be robust in the context of a changing climate. So I just wanted to point out, for those of you, if you're feeling that climate is not the biggest risk to your communities, it's still important to kind of have in the back of your mind, but how might climate change the context in which I address the risks that are the most important. So I just wanted to point that out. Great. So I've heard from the feedback that you've been giving me as we've gone through these different assessments of risk. I've definitely been hearing some ideas for potential adaptation projects. So we've got a few minutes left. It would be great to have some feedback and hear some ideas if any of you have also been thinking through this process of what potential adaptation projects might look like. But Lutando, I see your hands up. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Kath and the colleagues. I just want to congratulate you on the presentation that we've had and the comments that have been made by the colleagues, the inputs. I think they have been extremely important for the discussion. Now, I want to argue that for a longer part of the conversation, I think we focused on the effect of climate change on nutrition and what it does to the poor. But I wanted to bring another aspect of both medical and mental health, because it touches on all facets of our lives. So, for example, I am thinking about people like us who are based in rural areas, where sometimes when you have strong winds, you are likely to have power outages in hospitals. Yeah. And obviously some of these hospitals do not have a backup system. It obviously affects how healthcare system operates in the rural areas. But the second thing, in terms of medical health, is that when you have strong heat, You've got people who've got allergies, skin allergies, who are affected by the sun. And some people struggling with respiratory diseases. But also in terms of mental health, quite a number of people suffer from trauma when you have all these strong winds and all these natural disasters. So people struggle in terms of trauma and other means of mental health. So it's not just about how it affects production, how it affects food supply, and all of that. It's all the facets of our lives. So I just wanted to mention these two: mental health and medical health.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lutando. No, and I think that's a very good point, and that's why kind of when thinking about the exposure, that's why it's really important that we think across all the different different facets. Like when we think about population, of course, we should be thinking about the physical and mental health impacts there, and same with infrastructure. I mean, obviously a lot of the infrastructural related issues are perhaps not so much dealt with at community level, but more at district, province, and national level. And I know the health system is being considered in terms of ensuring that health staff are equipped to provide early warning on climate-related hazards, and also to respond to climate-related disease incidents, because as you rightly pointed out, kind of hotter temperatures, increasing dust, it creates lots of respiratory diseases, and on aggregate we see things like changing distribution of malaria transmission and other diseases that are related to kind of water availability and temperature. So definitely health impacts of climate change are really important. And I think it's important that you've mentioned the mental health aspects as well, because how like it must be really terrible, if you're constantly affected by either the hazard exposure, as you mentioned. I mean, for people that live in flood prone areas and find their houses being washed away regularly, I mean, I can only imagine how horrendous that must be, and not being able to provide for your family because of the vagaries of the climate at any one time. And there's actually increasing literature on the mental health impacts of climate change. And about 10 years or so ago, when I was involved in the IPCC assessment report, there was a lot of literature amongst Australian farmers in particular, because there was high levels of depression and high levels of suicide, even because they couldn't cope, with seeing their livestock dying off repeatedly in drought conditions and so on. So I fully agree that the health impacts of climate change also need to be considered. And yeah, hopefully as we undertake risk assessments, it gives us the opportunity to consider that side of things, of course, as well as production. Prim, please go ahead.
Thank you. I think this one we have overlooked, and I'd like us to carry along with people living with albinism, struggle with high heat.
Absolutely, yeah, and UV exposure.
Yes, and also high heat. When I was once in Israel, they ensure that you have water spots wherever you go and have a hat and sunscreen. I just want us to carry that with us as we continue, because almost all of us are affected by high temperatures. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Prim. And yes, I know, again, if I reflect on Malawi, where I spend a lot of time, I know the health departments there said that this is why they really need to know what future climate is going to be like in the long term and the short term, because they can make sure that they distribute enough sunscreen to people with albinism, and that they do so early enough in the season to try and reduce discomfort and so on. So I think this is why, you know, regardless of the sectors, we do need to understand the nature of climate risk so that we can put in place the appropriate adaptive measures. I see there's a couple of things coming up in the chat box. Would anyone else like to share perhaps any ideas on necessary adaptations that have come up as the result of kind of following this process?
Catherine, I do have a question though to the participants. I see lots of people, they do talk of gardening projects, like establishing a small garden and all that. But the main challenge is water. So how would that garden prosper if there is no water? How would they make sure that their crops have got enough water? I just wanted to know from the participants, because some they are submitting a proposal on food gardens, but their major issue is water shortage. So how do they address that? I just want to hear from the participants.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yes, great point. Great. Yeah, and I've seen a couple of things in the chat box. I mean, of course, we need to ensure production levels and food security, but sometimes adaptation just
I'm not sure if it's my network or it's Catherine's network. She seems to be breaking. Misa, can you hear Catherine?
I think she was breaking a bit. Her network, I think, is having issues.
Oh, okay. All right.
I think she will rejoin. It seems like she's left, but I'm sure in a minute she will rejoin the chat, the call.
Okay. So is a chat, Numisa can probably help with the name where they are talking of home gardening. Maybe they can respond on where they will get the water from, because in most of these sessions, all I could hear was that there's we don't have water for the plants. So if you establish a garden, where are you going to get the water from? It's I can't try to even pronounce the name.
Hi, Sandra. I'm trying to look through the chat. Do you know who sent the message?
It's MERWEVILLE. That's the name of the organization.
Oh, I see.
It's Mervevel.
Okay.
It's Mervevel, Sandra.
Okay, she has unmuted.
Yeah, it's Mervevel. Hi, everyone. That is the water shortages. That's that project about the grow gardening vegetables at home. That's also something that we need to think about a lot more, because that's a very important question. Where will we get the water from? So that was just an idea on how can we reduce this risk or hazard. So I think we need a little bit more information on that, on how or on where we will get the water from. So that is something that we need to think about.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I've also seen someone has written a chat, grow vegetables that need less water. Like that, for instance, we don't know what vegetables need less water. So that's things that we need to think about and discuss. Yeah, that will be our comment from the side. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you so much. I think we have also come to the end of this workshop. I'm sure, Catherine, we will give you feedback on, it seems she's with us. Catherine, are you with us?
Yeah, sorry. I'm exposed to the hazard of a power cut, and I'm vulnerable because I'm trying to connect. I'm back.
Thank you. Yeah, you can. I think you can wrap up. Then we close the session.
Great. Yeah, if I can just reflect on that question about water quickly, because I think that's a really important one, because of course, adaptation is only going to, if it's not going to be sustainable in the context of a future climate, then it's actually a maladaptation. So I think in cases where there's been mention of promoting food security, but that's reliant on water, the question is, well, how can we promote food security in a way that is not going to be reliant on water? So I would just encourage you to think about that. But yeah, so basically we've followed a simple process for outlining the nature of climate risk. I've shared, and hopefully they will be sent to you, the presentations, and I put 2 additional resources that may be useful going forwards, that you can access, and it will be great to hear more about how you're able to conduct perhaps slightly more detailed vulnerability assessments in conjunction with the communities in which you're working. And I hope that's useful to start informing the types of adaptation projects that you would like to develop. But thank you for your participation. I've really enjoyed hearing about the different contexts, and I wish you all luck. Back
All
to
right.
you, Sandra.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you. I think we now understand doing vulnerability assessment. We will keep on practicing. We'll use the videos as well as the resources that we do have. Thank you very much, Catherine. And to all the participants, thank you very much for taking your time to be with us here. Remember, we now have only 2 sessions that are left. The next one, we are going to be having a case study and learning from that. We also have someone who will be going through that process with us. It's going to be a very interactive session as well. And then the last session, we will be talking about the projects that you can actually implement, and the core grant application that you will be, that's what you will be doing on the last session. We encourage you to attend all these sessions so that when you write your proposal, you will have a very good high chance of getting the grant to implement your project. So for instance, this vulnerability assessment is going to help you when you write your proposal for the core grant. Seth will explain in detail when we do the core grant application. It's in 2 weeks' time, that session. I would like to thank you very much, and please, can you now open your video so that we can see you? Before we close, I would also want Seth to just have a word of thank you before we close. In the meanwhile, you can still open your videos while Seth is doing the closer for us.
Hi, Sandra. I was not planning to say anything, but since you gave me the opportunity, let me do so. But yeah, just to echo your sentiments, we really appreciate the enthusiasm, the excitement, and just the level of commitment that you guys have displayed ever since we started with this project way back. I think it was in July, if I remember, July or August. If I remember very well. And yeah, we're really looking forward to those innovative, out-of-the-box type projects, whether they be mitigation project, whether they be adaptation projects. We're really looking forward to seeing those applications come in. Yeah, so we thank you so very much, and we looking forward to seeing you in the last 2 or 3 sessions that are remaining. Just one point that I want to emphasize, that consistency of attending each and every session is very, very important, because each session builds on another, on a previous session. And I could hear all throughout this session that Katharine was going back to last week's session, trying to link for us the two sessions. So it becomes very important that that you attend every session. And if you can't attend and you want somebody else from your organization to attend, make sure that they go back and watch the videos of the previous sessions, so that when they come to this session, they are not lost. You know, they can follow what has happened in the past, and they're able to make a meaningful contribution to the sessions. But thank you guys, and thanks to Claire, Misa, Sandra, and Katharine for a wonderful presentation. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.